Today's episode is brought to you by Charles Russell Speechlys. Charles Russell Speechlys is an international law firm with a special focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business interests. With origins dating back to the 1800s, the firm has a long-standing reputation for building strong, trusted relationships with their clients. These relationships are crafted to deliver meaningful value and, like Charles Russell Speechlys, are designed to stand the test of time. In a world that is constantly changing, the steadfast, long-term relationships that Charles Russell Speechlys builds with their clients remains a constant. To learn more about their services and how they can help you, please visit www.charlesrussellspeechlys.com. Hi, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans, and experts. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two incredibly important heritage experts. Bart Peerless, who's a senior partner at Charles Russell Speechlys, and Sir Nicholas Coleridge. Bart has served as a senior partner at Charles Russell Speechlys for some time and is a senior advisor to a number of significant collections, estates, exhibitions, galleries. You name it, Bart advises them. And we're also joined today by Sir Nicholas Coleridge. Sir Nicholas's career has been nothing short of extraordinary. He held leadership roles at Condé Nast for 3 decades and finally finished serving as the chairman of the International Condé Nast publications. He then went on to become the chairman of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London from 2015 to 2023. Sir Nicholas is also now the chairman of the Historic Royal Palaces, and we'll hear more about them later. He's most recently, though, added to his litany of incredible and important roles in the heritage space, become the Provost of Eton College too. So there is so much to discuss with our guests on the show today, and I'm so looking forward to diving straight into this conversation. I hope you'll join me. And listeners, just so you know, please do, if you haven't yet, sign up to heritageexplore.com. Heritage Explore is a one-stop shop for all of the independent historic houses across the United Kingdom. We're adding more and more every week and every month. So be the first to hear about the newest house that's joined Heritage Explore, and also enjoy our library, which includes incredible interviews and articles by some really reputable historians, artisans and experts. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me today. We're so delighted and excited to have you both on the podcast. So thank you very much for being here. I'd love to just begin. I've given a very, very brief introduction to your illustrious careers. And I would just like to start really by hearing a little bit more about both of you in your own words. So Nicholas, please can we start with you? Just share a little bit about who you are and what you do today.
Well, I spent my long career in publishing, and now I've done 2 heritage jobs. You could even say 3 heritage jobs, since Eton has quite a lot of heritage in it, and certainly a lot of excellent curators and keepers. And I've always loved that mixture between beautiful houses, museums, galleries, the interaction with government, the need to get enough people to come into the museums and galleries and historic houses. And all of those things have slightly come together to give me a parallel life that I've hugely enjoyed.
Very excited to dive into all of that and the work that you've done historically and do today later in our conversation. And Bart, on to you.
So I'm here, I guess, partly as Charles Russell Speechlys' senior partner, and that's been a huge privilege to perform that role for the last few years, and I've got another 4 years to go in that, and partly because I'm a landed estates lawyer. And what draws me to landed estates, it's the extraordinary mixture of people and art and houses and architecture and land and history. And those are things that I grew up enjoying in a household that was passionate about history. And then I think that, through one's amateur enjoyment of those things, it's very easy to be drawn into that space. And intellectually, it has everything. It has tax law and chancery law. And I think in a long career, and most of us solicitors are in long careers, it's vital that your interest is kept going by things that are technically challenging, intellectually stretching. And that's this world.
Well, thank you, Bart. And you are known, Bart, for your extraordinary appetite and knowledge of everything that falls within the banner of British heritage. So it did for you ordinarily start when you were growing up, your love for all things.
I had two parents that were passionate about history. I mean, history in all its forms. And I guess, the 1970s and 1980s were a time when the heritage industry was starting to boom. And a large part of that, I think, was born out of country houses that had then opened up or started to open up after the Second World War. So we would always be happy to divert to the closest ruined monastery on a particular route, or I would go and help dig up the keep at Lewes Castle. And that turned into, I then started to volunteer. So I volunteered for a while at Standon, our local house in Sussex, and also worked in the regional auction rooms for one of the big auction houses under a particularly difficult porter who taught me an awful lot about the things that we handled, which was a lot of scientific instruments and silver and ceramics. But those things all naturally lead into the people that own and bought those things when they were new, and the intellectual curiosity of country houses and landed estates is enormous. So that's the journey here, I guess. Today.
Yeah. And also, I guess, just to sort of set the scene for our listeners as well, you just touched on it there, but a significant number of these private houses and collections were opened for the very first time, mostly and largely in the 1970s, a few, Bewley being the first, and Longleat in the 1950s. Yeah. Why did this trend emerge? Why did that have to happen? Just to contextualize it for our listeners.
Well, Bewley's a house and estate I know well. I think it happened because of the need for income in the first instance. So I think in that particular case, there had been significant death duties in the 1920s. And I think there was a business opportunity that arose where one could effectively use the house to bring visitors in, to help raise the profile of the house and bring income into the house. So that was the reason that houses opened in the first place. This was before many houses needed to open to show items that were conditionally exempt, of course. And of course, from that spun off all sorts of things that I'm sure we'll talk about later today. But that was the start of it, and Bewley was at the very start, as you said.
And Nicholas, you grew up with a family with such a deep historical legacy, and over the years you've been instrumental in sort of really igniting a newfound interest in the V&A Museum, and we're going to come on to hear more about the historic royal palaces and the role you now play as its chairman. But could you tell us a little bit about your early experiences with heritage growing up? I believe your family have a really fascinating ancestor in the form of Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Yeah, we do. We all descend from the brother of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But actually, I didn't really grow up in a kind of heritagey world at all. I mean, we used to go and look round houses that were open to the public. I grew up in West Sussex, and we used to go to Arundel and Petworth a great deal, and other lesser houses that are in the area. But that was very much in the way of a Sunday afternoon with, to get the children and my parents taking us for a walk and going for a walk through the park and then going into the house and looking at a few things. I would say that my interest in history and in heritage came rather later, actually.
Really?
Although I always loved going to those places that I've just mentioned. But it crept up on me in later life. The other day we put a huge statue of Samuel Taylor Coleridge at Ottery St Mary in Devon, which is where the Coleridge family have been based for a very long time, but not my branch of it. It's a terribly good statue. I've just bought one of the maquettes, one of the small things, and it was done by Nicholas Dimbleby, who's the third of the three famous Dimbleby brothers.
How fascinating.
And I think it's so clever when you see modern sculpture where people really can capture the sense of a face, and it's not just done in a kind of blobby way. It's a very, very good piece.
How amazing. We'll have to keep an eye out for that. And just for our listeners, Samuel Taylor was an English poet and also a founder of the Romantic movement of his time, right?
Yes, he's usually paired with William Wordsworth.
Yeah, exactly.
In that period. He was the one who was kind of groovier and had long hair and a fondness for opium, whereas Wordsworth became more and more conventional as his life went by and became poet laureate. They're both side by side in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. When I was growing up, Wordsworth was always the one that people considered the greater poet. And one of the rather lovely things is that over the last 30 years, that has reversed. And almost no university or school teaches Wordsworth apart from the poem Daffodils now.
Yes.
Whereas STC's had a bit of a revival, which is very good, nice for the family name.
Very, very nice. And Nicholas, you played such an enormously pivotal role in making museums and, I mean, you know, cultural sites, like your time spent at the V&A.
Well, I should say quickly that
Yes.
I don't think anyone who's chairman or even anyone who's director of these museums can make a massive difference. What I think you can do, because they're such huge organizations, and they're like a great battleship that takes long time to move in one direction or another. But it is very true that I had two very lucky breaks there. The first is that the V&A was heading already in a very good direction that Sir Paul Ruddock had left it in. And then Martin Roth, the director, left, and we were able to get Tristram Hunt to come and be the new director. And I found that I got on very well with him, and we managed to get all of our expansion plans. So we were able to build a new museum in Dundee, and we took over the Stoke-on-Trent Wedgwood collection and branded it V&A. And then there are two new museums that are going to be opening towards the end of next year, which were 10 years in the planning, which are going to be opening on the old Olympic Park, where the Olympics took place. It was a Boris Johnson, George Osborne legacy project, which then, fortunately, we were able to get Sadiq Khan and his team to continue the enthusiasm for. We had to make one big change. It was going to be called Boris's name, this Olympicopolis, rather like Albertopolis, which is the South Kensington. Yeah. Of course, very, very clever name, but arguably just slightly too fancy for people in the part of London where it is, and in the four new boroughs, particularly, that we've been trying to target of visitors from. So under Sadiq Khan, it was rechristened East Bank, which is going to work, I'm sure, very, very well indeed. But they're both amazing. Do you know the fact that I just simply didn't know about museums, and then we'll wheel round to how we did it? I didn't realise that 54% of all people who say that they live in London live east of the Tower of London. And,
really?
And this, in a way, reflects slightly or is revealing of the way that I grew up, because I grew up partly in London. And I don't believe we ever went further east than the Tower of London. That was the very furthest that my family ever went on a day out to see the Tower of London.
Yeah.
But in fact, London now stretches so far in that direction, and there are no museums there to speak of. There's the V&A, Young V&A, which used to be called the Museum of Childhood, is there?
Yes.
There's the Museum of the Home, just goes over the line. And then there's Greenwich, which is sort of south-east. But there's nothing else. Everything else is in West London or a little bit to the further west. So these two new museums are going to be very, very important. And it was a very exciting time to be involved.
I bet. And also, it must have been so important to get, you know, new people into and knowing about the V&A and sort of what it stands for and the incredible collection that it holds.
I completely agree with that. And did you know that the number of people who now visit the main national museums has grown so much in your lifetime? If you go back to the time of the great Sir Roy Strong, when he was director of the V&A, they had a party to celebrate 1 million visitors coming in a year. And it was seen at the time as a really marvellous thing and a whole new benchmark and a great record. Today, if it dips below 4 million, it would be considered a disappointing thing.
How extraordinary.
And it's growing and growing. And when you build in the other museums that are in the Victoria and Albert Group, it will soon be at 6 million.
That's extraordinary.
And the Tate is 6 million. The British Museum is at about 5.5. There's big numbers of people. And I've got a theory of why it is, actually. I think that people live in, or one reason, people tend to live in smaller and smaller spaces today, particularly young people. Flats that would once have had 3 people sharing have been divided up, so there's now 5 or 6. So you're tending to see only screens and rather small spaces. And I think one of the joys of going to heritage sites and to museums is you've got long vistas and you've got big rooms, and you can go out into the courtyards in the V&A and you can sunbathe, and if you're a child you can paddle in that pond that's there, and you can go into rooms that are enormous and are filled, and it's how amazing it is that one can go for free. Seems extraordinary. Long may that last, say I.
I completely agree.
And the presentation too has changed beyond recognition, hasn't it? They've moved from being relatively dry academic institutions 40 or 50 years ago to, we're going to go on to talk about narrative and storytelling, but actually the exhibitions are highly engaging. They're very imaginative in their subject matter. They must be appealing to a much wider audience at the same time, as well as being beautiful places.
Yes. Did you know that in the 1960s, the marble floors of the V&A at one point had been covered with lino? And it dates back to the time linoleum, just in case anyone doesn't remember what it is, because you don't see quite so much of it now. It dates back to the time when the Department of Education used to oversee all of the museums, and everything was done to make it as cheap as possible. And now that the museums are allowed to work with donors and philanthropists and to raise money through restaurants and through the shop, the amazing V&A shop, which brings in so much. So, by the way, to the shops at historic royal palaces.
Yes.
It's really amazing. I mean, you get profits of 6 million, 7 million, 8 million, which all helps to keep the show on the road.
Well, exactly. And actually that's, the sort of final question of this section. And I think it's so important to recognise there's that constant sort of tension between public access and preservation, because whilst it's incredibly important that places like the historical palaces and many of these historic privately owned family homes and public sector, estates and homes as well, are open, there is always this kind of ongoing tension of needing to preserve, the integrity of these places. And the museums in many ways have sort of been light years ahead in terms of, managing that balance, that delicate balance. Historic houses that are still in private hands, as we said earlier, have only really been open since the 1950s. So there's
a big difference though, because a museum is designed to have a lot of people wander around it.
Yeah, this is true.
And although many houses are designed in a sort of semi-palatial way to impress large numbers of people, they're not designed to have hundreds of thousands of visitors traipse around them in that sense. So I think you ask about the tension between, as it were, the preservation of the house and having visitors in it. A lot turns on the building you're talking about and the volume of people going through it. And I think one has to just be imaginative about private use, that time set aside for private use, rooms set aside for private use. Sometimes houses are just not well suited to having large volumes of people around them, so you move exhibitions into other parts of the building or estate that can more happily manage those large numbers of people. I think people have become much more sensitive to that issue than they used to be, but there's no doubt there is a tension between, what is it? Each time somebody wanders around a house, they put the building under pressure, don't they? So one has to be mindful of that.
Yeah, definitely. Fascinating. What an exciting start to the conversation. So on that note, we're going to move on to, I'm going to start by asking you, Nicholas, for your first and favourite destination for our listeners today. We're lucky enough to be getting a destination from each of you that you both love. 3 of them, in fact, from both of you during the course of this conversation. So I'd love to ask for your first. Where is it, and why do you have it as your first favourite place?
The first one I'm going to nominate is Seasoncott House in near Moreton in Marsh. It's open about 30 days a year, I think. It's the house that I would most like to live in the entire world, bar none.
Really?
It's Georgian on the inside and Mughal Indian on the outside, built in 1805. It is by Samuel Pepys Cockerell. It's got the most fantastic Repton garden around it, and it's and it sits at the heart of an incredibly beautiful and unruined estate. But there's something about arriving along the winding and long drive and seeing the dome of what looks like a Mughal temple coming up in front of you. And then the windows and the whole way it's done. It's really quite it's quite beautiful. It was built for a man called Cockerell, who was related to the architect, who'd been living in Bengal, and I expect he was a member of the East India Company, and he came back having made a lot of money, and he commissioned a house that took about 8 years to build. I think it's perfect. It has the right number of bedrooms. It has the most beautiful view. The detailing on the outside is absolutely glorious. It's got the most wonderful orangery that comes off on one side, all in the Mughal manner. And if I was to win the lottery, not once, and this is the Euro lottery, not once, but 3, maybe 4 times, belongs to the Kleinwort family, essentially, today. Right. Maybe I'm going to have to win it 5 times, but I would at least make a shot at it.
Yeah.
Because it would be perfect to live in, and utterly beautiful. The gardens with sculptures of snakes and waterfalls in the Indian manner. And if you're an Indiophile like I am,
yes,
it is a dream. So that is my choice.
How amazing. What a treat for our listeners to hear that in such beautiful detail. Well, thank you. And then Bart?
I can't match the detail and the description, but I'm going to give a nod to the first question. I think Bewley will be my choice. I've known it since I was so high through to now. The original house that was open to the public, and it has everything as a great family visitor attraction, from the river to the ruined monastery to Palace House to Buckler's Hard to the National Motor Museum to the monorail. It's been the most extraordinary, energetic place to be, and continues to draw huge numbers of people to that most beautiful part of the New Forest. So I think in the context of historic houses that are open to the public, Bewley has been a trendsetter for a very long time, and it's just an amazing place, and somewhere I've known for so long.
How amazing. Well, thank you. And they're 2 incredible recommendations for our listeners. So we're going to now move on to going into a little bit more detail for our listeners about, the sustainability within heritage, and hear from both of you on this. And Bart, I'm going to start with you. So, estates have found really innovative ways over the last sort of 70 years or so to become self-sustaining through events, festivals, corporate events, wedding, you name it. Estates are now sort of looking at a litany of ways to sustain and maintain themselves. Can you share some examples of how these activities have helped support estates, and what challenges they also present potentially?
Certainly. I mean, you've listed a lot of the different things estates do in your introduction there. So the key is diversification. And I think if estates started with opening the front doors to visitors who were excited to go and see the house at the end of the drive that they might have known a long time, they built out there from offering restaurants and teas and corporate events and weddings, and big set-piece events. And of course, what they've also done is built out their other sources of income through holiday cottages, longer-term lettings, maybe commercial property in the environs too. So diversification is partly about managing risk. Visitor attractions are difficult businesses to manage. You're susceptible to weather, to pandemic. The changes that were announced in the recent budget will have an impact on those sorts of businesses through NIC changes, through the minimum wage. If you have a very wet summer, as we've had this summer, then that will impact visitor numbers very quickly, and these businesses often have fixed overheads. So the more they diversify, and the more they can diversify into businesses that effectively allow people to pre-book, that guarantee those sources of income, that spread the risk, then the more they're likely to be successful. I think they all support each other, those businesses. So often what sits at the heart of the reputation is the fact the front door is open and the house is open and people can go and see a great building and great art. That brand, to give it its 20th or 21st century name, is what supports the weddings business, the corporate businesses, and all sorts of other things. So they have been very imaginative. They are hard businesses to run. They're people-intensive businesses. As I said, the fixed costs are high. What will change in the future? I think they will carry on looking at different opportunities to diversify their businesses. I think probably more of the big set-piece events and the nature of what people, we're going to talk about it later, the nature of what people want to go and see in a house is changing too. So the visitor attraction side, if I can call it that, of wandering around the house and looking at art is also definitely changing.
So true. And Nicholas, today in your role as the chair of Historic Royal Palaces, how does that collection, I mean, first of all, probably explain to our listeners a little bit about the Historic Royal Palaces would be really interesting. And then also, how do you now balance, and your huge team that I imagine sits beneath you and works very closely with you, how do you balance that need for, the financial need for getting people quite literally through the door with also, maintaining and preserving these iconic historic locations and historic palaces and places? You must constantly, and your teams must constantly be finding innovative ways to get around those challenges.
Well, sustainability and conservation are the two key things. And every meeting I go to, one or the other of them just about are being discussed.
On the agenda.
Always on the agenda, along with visitor numbers. For those who don't know historic royal palaces, there are 6 of them. They're all places that in one way or another have either belonged to the royal family or actually still belong to the royal family but aren't lived in. They are the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kensington Palace, the part that's open to the public, Kew Palace, Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, and the Banqueting House in Whitehall. And at any given time, there's an enormous amount of conservation going on in each. For example, in the Banqueting House, the Rubens ceiling is going to have to be taken down. It's a suspended ceiling.
Wow.
It's the largest ceiling by Rubens in this country. It was actually taken down once before during the war, rather interestingly, and very fast, and I think probably not well, because they had to do it really, really quickly. It was just when the Blitz was on, and as I understand it, about 20 men went up with saws, and they sawed that huge thing apart, and then it was taken in pieces, and some of them were kept in caves, and some of them were kept in the London Underground. And then at the end of the war, they were put back together again. And when you look up from the ground now, it still looks incredibly good. It's such a wonderful ceiling.
It really is.
But if you go closer, you can certainly see, join the dots, and it's not in anything like as good condition as it looks like. And so in order to do it, because it's so big and to conserve it, it's going to, HRP is almost certainly having to either build or rent a warehouse of immense size. And there it will be conserved over a period of about 3-4 years, and then it will be rehung, where it will last for many years. But on the sustainability front, if I just touch on Hampton Court, which is, of course, such an interesting building. If anyone has not been to it, just go there. It's wonderful the way that 2 sides of it are Tudor and have all the connection to Henry VIII and Wolsey and everyone. And then 2 sides of it are a sort of Baroque, Rococo, William and Mary, and they wanted it, all 4 sides, to be like that. But wasn't it lucky that the money ran out, and I think their lives ran out, actually, too. And so it wasn't done. So now you get these 2 entirely different facades.
Extraordinary.
And inside, there are hundreds, I can't remember the number, but I'm going to make it up, like 1,020 rooms in it. Some of them smaller than this one, some of them almost beaver size. and there they all are. And to look after them and to conserve them in all that is a really full-time task. then out in the grounds, it's so interesting the way that the team there, the grounds team, are changing what is planted now. They're choosing different trees to the trees that would have been there.
Fascinating.
Usually just a slightly different version of the same species. It's becoming clear that some types of horse chestnut now are slightly past their moment and diseased, but there are other types. Same things happening with oaks, etc., etc. And then many, many more areas around Hampton Court are being left wilder than they ever would have been. I wouldn't say they're exactly being rewilded, because they're not, because there's huge attention to detail. But in the way that the London parks, which used to be mown throughout and now have pleasing areas of long grass, which look so good, especially in the first half of the summer.
That's so true.
And all of this is being done at Hampton Court in a very systematic way. The planting of flowers are slightly different. The plants that they're putting in are different. And I think it's great that they're right in the vanguard of everything that's happening. And then we're doing the moat at the moment, planning to do the moat with a permanent sustainability, biodiverse planting. They did a rather wonderful thing called Super Bloom before my time, 3 years ago, which really was marvellous. It was marvellous, with flowers throughout the moat. In my childhood, by the way, the moat just used to be full of plastic rubbish and puddles, and people used to just throw stuff in. Now it's already looking marvellous, but it's going to look even more marvellous with a stream running through it and joining back at Traitor's Gate, and and all of these plants specially chosen to be one of the green lungs of that part of London.
How extraordinary.
As you know, is all high-rise buildings.
Yeah. It would be remiss of me not to sort of almost mention as well filming, because I think filming has become, I don't know whether this does exist at historic royal palaces and if that's allowed to happen at various royal palaces, but and I'd be curious to know, but I think it's had such an impact on driving the demand of, visits to these places across up and down the country.
Yes. I mean, I'm trustee of a house which has been used a great deal for filming. It's been a hugely valuable source of income for that house. And although it displaces other sources of income to a certain extent, the filming more than makes up for it. Inevitably, there's some wear and tear. Inevitably, it's quite inconvenient if you live there at the same time. But I think it's, as you say, it's taken these houses and the art and furniture that sits within them to a genuinely global audience. And that's been phenomenal. I think it's changing a bit. I mean, I understand, for example, now that many studios are saying they will only film within 30 miles of the studios, and that's for environmental reasons. So I think we will see some of that change a bit. And I think as the studios get more sophisticated, the extent to which they actually need to be on site and filming in the building itself rather than doing quite a lot of this in the studios will also change. But I think the income that has been generated by filming has been exceptional, and in some cases it's been a lifeline, actually.
Yeah, I agree.
There are two major shows been filmed at Hampton Court recently. One is Wolf Hall, and the latest series is on at the moment. Can hardly think of a more appropriate place to do it, because that's where some of it was. And then the other great success has been Bridgerton. And whether one loves Bridgerton or one has slight reservations about Bridgerton, they filmed many, many episodes of it in the gardens at Hampton Court. And a lot of visitors who come, they don't say, oh, it's so interesting to see the palace of Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey and Queen Mary or something. They say, oh, how so interesting to see the Bridgerton set,
so
as they
true.
call it. But how great.
Yeah. Well, as you said, I mean, you said earlier, Nicholas, you arrived with your interest in heritage and history at a later date. And if this is sort of, to me, if this is the catalyst for getting more young people into heritage initially, it might be that they go there to see the Bridgerton set, but then inevitably they'll fall in love with the Henry VIII story as it relates to Hampton Court or any other historic place. I
think the one thing about the Tudors is they still transcend everything. I
think
they are the sort of megastars of history, and it seems to be... It is still taught, I think, in a very interesting and lively way in the curriculum. But it's a sort of it's a manageable group through a manageable period of history that people can really get their heads around. And I know in houses where there's a Tudor connection, where I, as it were, a trustee or act, that's a big pull still for visitors. I'm sure that must be true of Hampton Court.
It is, and I entirely agree with you. Isn't it odd how history in schools is nearly always the Norman conquests, then the Tudors, then the causes of the First World War. Yeah. And that's it, unless you go on to do it at university.
I know. It's almost a shame that it's not mandatory that we all sort of do much more of it. But I guess you come to it at a later stage in life. And I'm so curious to know, this is a question really for both of you, but, so many of these estates, the collections that they hold have in some senses become to some degree a lifeline for some estates over the course of their history. And obviously the objective is that, you always want to keep collections intact, not least because it makes for a far better sort of visitor experience in the 21st century. But obviously historically there's a huge amount of legacy that's attached to these collections. I don't know the history of the historical palaces and whether they've ever sort of famously lost or had to sell, any sort of items from their collections. But, can you maybe, Bart, start just by discussing, the emotional, difficult decisions that sometimes have been made in selling very valuable.
It is always hugely difficult to be the person to be seen to have sold an object that has been in the family a very long time. But I think one has to also remember that the value of objects is driven more by fashion than perhaps we sometimes like to admit. So there is no guarantee that the wonderful stubs on your wall will be worth more next year than it was last year. And fashions do change, and I think they change ever faster in the world of collecting. So normally important items from a collection are only sold when there's a very good reason to sell them, and that is to plough the money back into the estate, to reinvest in income-generating assets or restoring important items or restoring the house itself. So, yes, one treads very carefully around those issues, but actually, in many cases, the proceeds of sale have been put to very good use and enabled the family and the house in question to go on and flourish in other ways. So always a very emotionally charged issue, perhaps more so than it need to be, and often once the item is sold, often goes on display somewhere where it's seen by many more people and the proceeds are, as it were, reused, ploughed back into the estate. That concern goes away.
I think acceptance in lieu has been, I'm going to do a little shout out for it. God, it's been a good thing.
Yes.
Gosh, it has. And, at the V&A, every year, 5 or 6 really important things would come to the way of the museum, just as they also go to the National Portrait Gallery and the National Gallery, etc., which otherwise would simply have left the country and gone. And I find very often the owners, I'm sure they loved having it in the dining room, who wouldn't? But, things happen. And they get used to it, and they seem quite proud to see it beautifully displayed and looked after forever, and they no longer need to insure it. And they, if they did insure it at all, and they no longer have the responsibility quite for it. And then, with any luck, it has a nice label at the bottom. If it's sort of nicely written up, they seem very, very happy to see crowds of people looking at their favourite picture.
Couldn't agree more. And Nicholas, final question really is, you, as I mentioned in my introduction, you spent 3 decades at Condé Nast in publishing. How do you think that's gone on to inform, Condé Nast is arguably the arbiter of storytelling, of sort of contemporary life, depending on which publication you're specifically referring to, there are many. But how do you think that's gone on to inform the roles that you've then subsequently gone on into, your time at the V&A and then now subsequently, obviously, as the Chair of Historical Palaces and the Provost of Eton as well?
Well, everywhere I've worked has had archives. That's what they have in common. At Condé Nast, the archives of British Vogue were immensely valuable and incredibly good and very, very well kept by a team of archivists. And there were all the works of the great photographers for 100 years, the original prints and everything. People used to come and look at them like they would in a museum, although we had to get more and more careful about that over time. And so it is at Eton, where there are 19 curators, at the V&A, where there were 1,164 staff, slightly fewer after COVID, but a huge number of people and at historic royal palaces where there's getting on for 1,000, all of them so committed to keeping these pieces. At HRP, Historic Royal Palaces, quite a lot of the wonderful paintings are also loaned by the Royal Collections Trust and are hung there. So some belong to the palaces and have been there since the time of Henry VIII. And some of them are on loan from the Royal Collections. And I think they sit very well side by side. Amazing mantegnas at Hampton Court. Really marvellous.
Oh, how amazing.
Can I do a little detour into archives and tie it into conditional exemption, though? Because they are extremely well suited to conditional exemption archives, difficult for individuals to maintain in the right environment in their private homes, very difficult to give public access to archives. And there's been a huge interest in growing interest in archives over the last few decades. So we have increasingly seen people want to present their family archives and gain conditional exemption on them, or acceptance in lieu, sorry. So yes. I think that's become a really interesting and important area, and interest in archives has just grown so exponentially.
I so agree, and it's become quite a problem for the museums, actually, and libraries, because people kindly want to give you these things, but you do realise that it's also saving them having two archivists who they're paying. And then the museums and heritage sites have an obligation not just to look after them for 10 years, but to look after them forever.
Yes.
And so people, they've become much more picky and more selective about what is taken. There was a time about 4 years ago when every single one of the big ballet companies rang up as though they were doing a huge favour to say, we're prepared to give you the archives. And
4 lorries arrive tomorrow,
and if we'd taken them all, I mean, it would have filled this entire building that we're sitting in today.
Extraordinary.
But anyway, it's generally a very good thing that they're looked after and
kept in good order.
And because of the interest in them, they become more valuable, which makes them more interesting for acceptance in lieu, for example. Yeah. And I think it was probably the Churchill papers, wasn't it, that sort of kicked off that fashion, as it were, which were ultimately saved for the nation after a fairly long negotiation. But that, I think, before then, by and large, people had assumed that those sorts of written archives were not particularly valuable, of niche interest.
Yeah,
but
I completely agree.
They require a lot of care.
Yeah,
they absolutely do.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That was such a fascinating conversation just then with you both. And now we're going to come on to hearing about your second favourite place, space, building, you name it. So, Nicholas, I'd like to start with you again, please.
Well, I'm going to name as my second choice a building that I had not visited until about 2 years ago, which is Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. I'd been hearing about it for years, but I hadn't seen it. And I first saw it when I was scouting historic royal palaces, since I had to be interviewed on my suitability to be chairman. So I thought the very least I should do is make sure I'd seen all 6. There's no good saying I'd only seen 5. Gosh, what a revelation it was. It's the most interesting house. It's although it's called a castle, it isn't really a castle. It's a Georgian country house that was built on the command of Wills Hill, who was the first Marquis of Downshire at the time when the Downshires seemed to own all the land between Belfast and right down into the south, I mean, way down to Dublin and beyond. They built this lovely house. Then it became the home of the Governor-Generals. People forget that Northern Ireland had a Governor-General, just like India had. And there were 7, I think, lived there. And now it's partly a tourist attraction, i.e. it's open most days of the week. The most wonderful gardens. It's been so well redone. It's in such a great position. Then the King and Queen have apartments there, which they're Northern Ireland base. And then the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland also has flats there, and it's where Molam used to be when she was the Good Friday Agreement and everything was happening. What I love about it is it's on the edge of Hillsborough village, which has one of the most beautiful high streets. It's just one of those.
Really?
It's just like those where it's like, I'm trying to think of other examples, Bolton on the Water, all those ones that are filmed and photographed because they're everything that people think about the United Kingdom and most love, if they love that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wonderful pubs all the way down it and no buildings that have ruined it at all. Then it's got amazing gardens, which had fallen into disrepair, really, or were being looked after in the most cheap way, as it would be if the government is paying. And now, inspired by the king, who seems to have all the time in the world for making gardens more and more beautiful. It's one of the many, many, many good things about him, that wherever he occupies or wherever he touches becomes more beautiful. And all sorts of Irish and designers from both sides of the border have been involved in making it lovely. And inside, it's been entirely repaired and repointed, and it feels like a private house with some beautiful paintings and an amazing investiture room where at this very moment a new carpet is being woven in Afghanistan by tribeswomen. And it's being made by that charity that Rory Stewart's wife Shoshana runs, Turquoise Mountain. And it's huge. And I believe lots of different villages are making it, and it's all going to be sewn together. I think it's a magical place. Not nearly enough people have been to it. No one who goes to it ever can't understand why they haven't been before. It's one of the great sights of Northern Ireland.
Gosh.
And it's looking at its peak, and we're about to do the fort, which is on the top of the hill as an extra visitor attraction, preferably somewhere where people can have weddings, since obviously our hunger for revenue means that we need to be looking for that too. So I really recommend it.
How amazing. Thank you, Nicholas. What an incredible description. Definitely, it's on my list. It's been on my list for a very long time to visit. And Bart?
Well, back to my childhood again, and now I know Nicholas is a Sussex lad too, but I'm East Sussex, not West Sussex. And you mentioned Petworth House, which is the most beautiful house, and I think is when one thinks of great National Trust houses and great architecture, one is drawn to places like that. So I'm not going to choose Petworth, wonderful as it is, but I'm going to choose a house I mentioned briefly earlier, which is Standon, closer to where I grew up in Sussex. And I think the reason I choose Standon is, first of all, it is a wonderful piece of domestic architecture by Webb, beautifully decorated and furnished by William Morris. But also because it taught me to be open-minded about art and architecture. Because I think when you think of country houses, you think of places like Hillsborough or like Petworth Park. But actually, the arts and crafts movement opened my eyes to wonderful domestic design. It was born at the same time as a social movement that was so interesting, their focus on the domestic side of architecture, on the details. When I as you're so stationed in a room, and I would always say to people, look at one thing really hard. And so, for example, a favourite was the wonderful copper-beaten light fittings in the billiard room, all of which are sunflowers and which are different in every way, or the German nickel firebacks. And I think at that time in particular, in the 1980s, the arts and crafts movement was not particularly fashionable. But it is a beautiful house that opened my eyes to keeping my eyes open to beauty in all its forms. And so I would like to do a shout-out for Standon in the Weald overlooking the Ashdown Forest in my part of Sussex, and for the arts and crafts movement, which continues to be much overlooked, but is just wonderful.
How amazing. So Bart and Nicholas, we're going to move on to the final section of our conversation and move on to the present and the future for historic sites, places, spaces. And so, Nicholas, I wanted to start with you. You've been at the helm, as we've been discussing, the historic royal palaces for a year?
Just over a year.
Just over a year. And I'd be so curious to know what your vision is of the future for historic royal palaces and where you see it going. There's so much coming down the track in relation to experiences. There has been such an incredible uplift of appetite with domestic and international visitors alike to see historic houses and heritage in greater numbers. I think mostly post sort of COVID, it's been this sort of ever increasing wave that has been happening for a long time, but it really felt, and I do agree with what you said earlier, Nicholas, about, I do think it's reflective, or it's a byproduct of people living in increasingly smaller places. But what's happening? You know, what do you see the future of historic royal palaces being, to your mind?
I think there's two completely different sides to it. One is the conservation of the palaces, where the charity, which is Historic Royal Palaces, has an absolute obligation to make sure that they're looked after in such a way that they will always be better and never worse, and that they will always be in better and better condition, and that every tapestry should be repaired and blah, blah, blah. But then there's a second mission, which is one that much emphasis is being put on at the moment, and that is to try and get more and different people to come. It's very easy, it won't surprise you to hear, for middle class families whose children are studying the Tudors and can easily come, and they have the routine of going on these kind of outings and an interest that is very often imbued in the parents, and they know where it is and they can afford to come because these places are never quite as cheap as you hope that they're going to be to get in, because they're so expensive to keep up. So a lot of effort's being put in at the moment through persuading philanthropists and donors and trusts to give money to enable schools that have never brought anyone to any of these places. Take the Tower of London. The Tower of London is on the edge of Tower Hamlets, which is the poorest or possibly second poorest borough of London.
Yeah.
Most of the schools there don't bring their children to the Tower of London. The Tower of London is always full. It's an enormously successful operation, and the queues to get in are long, and the yeoman warders people love, and it's got the crown jewels, which of course is incredibly attractive for people to come and see. But many schools don't, and also many people don't. And so we're doing an experiment there at the moment, which I think is commendable, where if you are a family on universal credit, if you show your paperwork that you're on universal credit, you can come in for £1 a head rather than the £21 that it costs for an adult now to come into the Tower of London, or roughly £10 for a child. And this is working, and we're getting lots of people coming in, and it's not instead of the people who are coming, but it's as well as, and we try and make sure that the people who are coming in on this, either for free or on this almost free deal, come at the times of day when it's less crowded, so they don't get hemmed in. And we're also doing a thing which I think is also to do with the future of it at the Tower. 4 of the turrets, which of them are either empty or have got, you know how turrets that aren't used much become a sort of dumping ground.
Yes.
It's like in life, I expect you do know. And they're being cleared out and turned into lunchrooms where local schools are going to have lots of places that they can sit, and they can bring their picnics, and they can hang up their coats, and there's going to be a loo or 2, preferably a loo or 10, actually.
Yeah.
But that's the plan, to try and make it more comfortable. At the moment, actually, if you come in a school party and it starts to rain, you have to sort of slightly shelter against a wall because there is nowhere where you can sit. And so we're trying to do all of those things, get more people to come, look after them very well indeed. And in my strong opinion, not dumb down. I'm very happy that Historic Royal Palaces, in its labelling, which is such a big part of these things, they're not dumbed down. They're written in a nice, clear, friendly way, but they don't apologise for our history.
Yeah.
They interest our visitors in our history.
And why is that so important to you, Nicholas? That it's not dumbed down or it's not oversimplified?
I think there's too much of that going on, actually. History is history, and I think it's important to try and learn history right through and to understand why people thought different things and made different decisions at different times. I think it would be rather arrogant for us to assume that in the year 2024 we've reached an absolute peak of civilization and emotional intelligence that no previous generation ever had, because actually in all sorts of areas, including architecture, he says controversially, I actually, on the whole, don't think we have.
So true. I could not agree more. And I mean, Bart, from your point of view, I think you must spend an awful lot of time, advising various estates.
What brings the punters in? To use that phrase.
Exactly.
I mean, I think it slightly ties back to what we mentioned earlier, which is that the reasons people visit these houses, these great houses and estates, are changing. Of course, they will change. And actually that ties in with the comment about selling collections, which is the number of people that go to a house to look at the fabric of the house, the architecture of the house, the wonderful paintings on the wall is not as great as it was. They see it as a set for Bridgerton, maybe, and a fascinating place to be. But actually these days the thrust, I think quite rightly and interestingly, is towards storytelling, understanding things in the context of their time. We don't assume knowledge anymore that people understand what a particular item was used for, because they may not. So what was the history of the people that lived here, that both owned it, that worked there? What were these items used for? Tell us some stories that will help us put that in context. And certainly if I think of, when we did the thing of dragging our children around all these sorts of places, if you ask them to remember what they would remember in interactive, immersive things such as not being able to pick up the sword at the Battle of Hastings Museum, or tasting medieval food at Lindisfarne Abbey, or nearly hitting Daddy with an arrow at Lindisfarne Abbey. All those things is what they will remember. I mean, and of course they will go back and see other things in their lifetimes, and hopefully with their children. But that sort of sense of medieval food was horrible, Daddy, is really powerful, and it does. And I think the stories are brilliantly told. By the way, I mean, it's easy if you tell somebody a story, they remember it, and of course they do. But I think the storytelling, the interpretation now, to open the window into the history of these places is really exceptional. Is not at all dry. Because you have to remain relevant. You have to remain relevant to people. Because if you don't, if they become a narrow pursuit and a narrow intellectual pursuit, they will die because people will stop going. But actually, once people are there, they're hooked, because history has something for everybody, doesn't it? That's the truth.
It does. And I would say the storytelling, if you haven't been to see the Crown Jewels lately,
that's amazing.
The new way it's been done is so much better.
I haven't seen that. Why? What about it is...
They just tell the story of each crown in a really interesting way. There are maps showing where the different jewels came from. They explain so clearly how each diamond or emerald came into the hands of the crown, and which ones were worn by different people. And it's just very, very well done. I think they've got it exactly right. And I can see people appreciating it and thinking, gosh, how interesting. And then, of course, because we've had the coronation recently, people are particularly alert to crowns and maces.
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it, how much the coronation does have a humongous impact on people's sort of international interest.
And the BBC coverage was very good at telling the story of different items. If I remember correctly, they would sort of pause it and say, this is what this was and this is where this has come from. So, but it did, those are the stories that stick in people's minds.
So I guess as a final sort of a semi-final question, I'd love to know, you've both sort of touched on in various ways, and I certainly know, having, not only grown up at Beaver, but then actually going and sort of making Duchess for a few years with my mother, and subsequently building Heritage Explore and spending an awful lot of time at historic houses up and down the country. They are so central to their local areas and communities that surround them. And Nicholas, you just touched on how, the V&A now actually having a new position in the East Bank is important to sort of engage people locally with the V&A. Why is that so important? And why is it so important that we all have access to heritage? Why do we spend so much time, money, effort, energy on, ensuring these places are maintained and sustained? What do you believe they do for today's generation and for future generations?
It's very good for the soul. It definitely is. And I think it takes people. Well, I'm going to use a cliche when I say it takes people out of themselves, but actually, most people are very interested in things that they come and see. Well, before we opened the yet to open museum in East Bank, there was quite a lot of groups were held with young people who live in Haringey and Hackney and Newham, being asked what they wanted to see in a museum, and a large number of people replied that they wanted to see exhibitions of trainers, which you, of course, could see in Westfield, which is right next to the where the new museum's going to be. But when they were shown actual interesting things, people's capacity to show interest and to become interested is rather great, actually. We moved there are going to be quite a lot of the Indian collection will be held down there, the Islamic collection, big photography, fashion. The V&A holds a huge fashion collection.
Yes.
And that's going to be far more visible. It's going to be far easier for people to see it.
That's so exciting.
And I think it's a lot to expect someone who lives beyond the Olympic Park to travel all the way to the well-established national museums. It's an hour and a quarter on the tube sometimes. It's a long way to come.
Yeah.
And it's expensive to come. And I think it's going to be very, very popular. And the curators there are balancing very carefully between making sure that some of the great treasures of the collection are on show there, and then also some more locally inspired pieces, things that speak to the history of Hackney and Haringey as well.
Fascinating.
So people have a hook into it. That's the plan.
That's so exciting.
But it's good for the brain and good for the soul and good for well-being.
I completely agree. And Bart?
It's very difficult to add to that, in all truth. I think the value of history as presented by the Country House is simply the value of history more broadly. I think the way that they are rooted in their environments, the way that they have supported whole communities, the way that they have changed over time with fashion and taste, all of that is incredibly valuable for people to see and understand. The most important thing, of course, is that, as you said, Nicholas, the present doesn't have a monopoly on knowledge. Easy to forget when the present is very noisy. And I think an understanding that the history is a foreign country, they do things differently there is a favourite quote, and that other people thought they viewed the world differently and thought they were no less right and might or might not have been proved to be right. So all that is relevant. And in the context of a country house, it is given a social setting and a family setting and an artistic setting, which I think is just wonderful and brings all that alive off the page or off the computer screen when people are studying history. So
true.
And those houses continue to provide this, that cornerstone of many communities, employing people, using local produce,
local craftsmanship as well.
Local craftsmanship, giving a reason for people to go to the localities. So many of them are linchpins of their local communities.
Yeah.
And so for all those reasons, that's highly relevant.
I completely agree. Well, just the most enormous thank you to you both so much for joining me today. We need to finish and must finish with your final suggestion of where would be your favourite final place that you'd like to share with our listeners, Nicholas?
I'm going to choose the Aston Webb front of the V&A, mostly because it very strongly changed my feelings about Edwardian architecture.
Interesting.
When I was doing architecture at university, which mostly consisted of sitting in the dark looking at slides, I liked it hugely. But I used to be a bit sneery, I don't know why I was, about Edwardian architecture. And I've actually completely changed my mind, largely because of Aston Webb, who I think the longer I spent in that museum looking at how different bits fit together, I think he was genius. The heights of the ceilings, the way that it connected to existing parts of the museum. And then from learning about him there, of course, I realised already that Buckingham Palace, the front, is Aston Webb, and so is Admiralty Arch, and all the rest of it. And my eye changed and became much more forgiving. I always one of those people who thought that William and Mary and Georgian architecture was what I like most. But I don't think I do think that
really?
anymore. I've been on a journey.
But also, you have to just share with our listeners a little bit about your own architectural project that you undertook and was complete in 2020. Would you be happy sharing a little bit about the Folly at
you are kind.
Wolverton Hall?
God, I feel a bit embarrassed talking about that in the context of the other three buildings.
Because
I
it really is the most extraordinary octagonal
yes, it's an
Folly.
octagon, and it was designed by the architect Quinlan Terry quite brilliantly. Because I didn't know him, and I wrote to him out of the blue, and I said that I was sure he would say no, but would he have any interest in rather a small project of building a Folly in our garden? And he came and had lunch a couple of weekends later, and I showed him some terrible drawings that I'd done on scraps of writing paper of roughly what I had in mind. And 5 weeks later, back came the most inspiring and amazing drawings and for it. And we went ahead and built it, and it's 2 stories with the battlements sort of viewing thing at the top I would say it's a Jacobean, it's brick, and it's in a sort of Jacobean, Georgian twist of Gothic kind of way. Great windows. And I thought it looked particularly nice with 2 tents attached at either end for our daughter's wedding.
Very recently, yeah. Well, it really is the most beautiful. I hope our listeners go in and just Google it because it's such a beautiful Folly, and you use it, don't you, as partly an office at the top.
Yeah. It's my office when I'm at home, and it's got very, very good Wi-Fi, which nowhere else in our house does.
I can't imagine many Follies up and down the country have good Wi-Fi. Really.
Well, it's amazing that this one does. It really, on the whole, does.
Yeah.
And during COVID, when we had our 4 children and at least 3 of their love interests staying with us for what felt like forever.
Yeah.
They were all totally amazed that they couldn't do simultaneous Teams calls in every single room, which they certainly couldn't. The system kept going down.
Yeah.
But it does work over there. And I'm so proud of that we did it. And everything was, all the bricks, which were specially made, were all done local to us. And I'm so pleased we got planning permission.
It's so incredible.
And it rather has added to the fun of life. So.
Yeah, I bet it has. And Bart, your final favourite place?
I'm going to ask Nicholas, no Aston Webb influence in your Folly?
No, Quinlan Terry, pure and simple.
Fantastic. I'm going to break the rules a bit. So I'm going to choose a landscape, and it's not a formal landscape. It's the landscape I looked over and love, which is the South Downs, and in particular that stretch between Lewes and Eastbourne, wonderful Tudor and Georgian Lewes, and wonderful High Victorian Eastbourne, where sit Firle House and Glynde and Glyndebourne, of course. And it's just that wonderful ancient English landscape. The light off the sea, the rolling hills, the Ram Inn at Firle. Give me 100 reasons why that is a wonderful part of the world. And it is just an incredibly beautiful, I think slightly overlooked part of the world now, as everyone tends to race through that bit of Sussex, but has remained an important part of the world for artists, for architects. The Bloomsbury Group, of course, at Charleston, very popular again now. And that just keeps drawing me back. And there's something homely and not particularly grand, but wonderful about it. So that's I'm breaking your rule, but that stretched the Downs in East Sussex for me.
Well, thank you so much, Bart and Sir Nicholas, for sharing your extremely valuable time and obvious passion for what you both do in the world of heritage. And I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you both, so thank you.
What a treat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Thank you.